Man, this DS is great. The only thing I really wish is that I wish I could just feel the 3D of these games. I mean, it's more 3D than the GBA, but I want to be inside of this. This is awesome! Everyone has a first handheld console, and if yours was the Atari Lynx, I am so sorry. Nintendo has pretty much always been at the forefront of the handheld gaming market ever since the Game Boy was introduced in 1989. Finally, we could play our home consoles on the go. Kind of. Handhelds lack the power of home consoles, but make up for that with their portability and convenience. I can play the Game Boy on the toilet, but I can't do that with my Xbox or any home console, except the Switch. Nintendo has us covered. I got my start on handhelds with the Game Boy Color, which I still have right here. Yeah, I broke my original Game Boy Color when I was a kid, but luckily I immediately moved on to the GBA, which was where I really started to play a lot of handheld games. I had such a wide variety of Pokemon, Namco Museum, and more Pokemon. I've said this time and time again, but I really only played Pokemon on my handhelds for the vast majority of my childhood. It didn't get diverse at all until I got a DS Lite in the manliest of colors, pink. The DS and Wii era is really when I began to learn and get more into gaming rather than just playing random games my mom bought me as gifts. The DS holds such a near and dear place in my heart because of that, and I will always love it. But it was never really the most powerful or best handheld it could be. I was always too big of a Nintendo fanboy to admit it at the time, but the PSP really dwarfs the DS in terms of power, and they really came out at about the same time. Nintendo knew the DS was becoming outdated and they needed to upgrade to a more powerful console. So what did Nintendo do? What they always do, and created a brand new gimmicky console still with less power than its competitors that would dominate the handheld market for nearly a decade after already dominating it for the previous 2 decades. Nintendo has been experimenting with 3D in their consoles dating all the way back to the 1980s. They had a set of glasses for the Famicom in Japan which allowed for 3D effects in 1987. However, it never really gained any traction and was never released outside of Japan. And due to this failure, Nintendo asked themselves, how do we fail even harder? Intentionally make our system harder to produce games for? No. How about we do a horrible job at marketing? No. I got it, sir. What if we do both of those things, then also make our system so gimmicky that nobody in their right mind will ever want to play it, and then we'll also price the shit out of it? This man is a genius! 1995 came around, and with the development of Nintendo's next console, the Nintendo 64, taking longer than anticipated, they shifted to producing a new console in the meantime. Because why release a subpar console when you could make an even more subpar console? The Virtual Boy was Nintendo's first fully stereoscopic 3D console, and with such an innovative idea, I'm sure it blew the market away. Sold decently, broke even, did better than the Wii U. Damn, it's impressive to be that bad. The Virtual Boy is Nintendo's biggest flop of a video game console to this day. Fewer than 1 million were ever sold in total, and only 22 games were even released for the system. The system's 3D effect was so power intensive that they could only produce games in black and red color scheme, which completely took away from the joy Nintendo games give off. The games overall were fine, but why am I going to spend $200 on a console when Mario 64 is right around the corner? That would be like spending hundreds of dollars on Wii's when the Nintendo Switch is the main console now. Who would ever do that? Even after the Virtual Boy, Nintendo didn't completely stop thinking about 3D gaming in their consoles. They tried different ways to implement it on the GameCube, Game Boy Advance SP, and DS, which much of that research going into their next handheld console. With 3D becoming more and more prevalent in the entertainment industry, and with gaming shifting that way too, who better to include random gimmicky bullshit into their next major console than Nintendo? Today, we're taking a look at the Nintendo 3DS. Development for Nintendo's successor to the DS began all the way back in late 2009. Nintendo controlled nearly 70% of the gaming industry's handheld market. That's nearly the amount of dumb ideas they've had since then too. They knew their next handheld console would likely hit it big, and they didn't want to move completely away from the DS name as it had become worldwide known. Satoru Iwata hinted that the system was going to incorporate a motion sensor, and an unnamed developer stated that it did have a tilt function similar to an iPhone, but quote, does a lot more. Nintendo officially announced the 3DS console on March 23, 2010, but it wasn't officially revealed until Nintendo's conference at that year's E3. They revealed multiple games, bringing back classic franchises like Kid Icarus, as well as remaking fan-favorite games like Ocarina of Time. Everyone immediately could see the power and impressiveness of the new system and were eager to buy it. I can't wait to get lost in the water temple again while burning my retinas! In September, Nintendo announced to be released on February 26, 2011 in Japan, and then in March for Europe, North America, and Australia. At a beginning retail price of, you've gotta be f***ing kidding me. Nintendo's initial price for the system was a bit steep. They thought they could pull a fast one on us Nintendo fans who will buy anything from them. You're wrong though, Nintendo, I have standards. Not very high standards, but I have them. Almost immediately, sales weren't reaching expectations, so Nintendo gave the system a huge price cut all the way down to $170, which was much more realistic. In order to not piss off every fan who purchased the system before the price cut, Nintendo began what they called the Nintendo 3DS Ambassador Program. As long as the user had accessed the eShop before August 21st, 2011, they would be eligible to download 10 NES games and 10 Game Boy Advance games for free. This was an incredible deal for 3DS owners, and honestly one of the coolest things Nintendo has ever done. The early access NES games were all made available later for everyone through the eShop, so I'm sure that means the Game Boy Advance games will be too. Oh, it says no. For some reason, Nintendo refused to ever make any Game Boy Advance games available on the 3DS Virtual Console. Why would you never do this even though you clearly can make them run on the 3DS? And you want to know what the worst part is? They claimed it was because they couldn't get GBA games to run on the console. What the f*** are you talking about, Nintendo? You literally got 10 games working on the system less than a year after it came out. And it's not like they were 10 small games either. They had Fire Emblem, Kirby and the Amazing Mirror, Yoshi's Island, Metroid Fusion, and the Minish Cap, just to name a few. You can port these games over, but not something like Sonic Advance or Golden Sun? F*** you, Nintendo. At least you can play GBA games on the Wii U, but who the hell would ever want to do that? It's a handheld game. Why would you only make it available on the home console's eShop? Nobody asked to play a home console game on a handheld. Son of a bitch. With handheld consoles getting more and more powerful, developers began to realize they could make full home console experiences for handhelds. This began more with the original DS and PSP, but the 3DS is really where this phenomenon took off. Ocarina of Time 3D, Pilot Wings 3D, Star Fox 64 3D, Majora's Mask 3D. Wow, it's like the console is called the 3DS or something. It felt like the entire Nintendo 64's library was ported over, but they were all incredibly warranted and improved nearly every experience. These games were all over a decade old, so recreating them for a modern system with the graphical upgrades for newer generations to play was a phenomenal idea. I mean, I don't need another excuse to play Majora's Mask, but I'll sure as heck take one. Zelda handheld games a lot of the time get the short end of the stick even when they're amazing, so giving Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask some time to shine on the 3DS helped people realize that maybe Zelda can be good on the go. Most of the time. These remakes were so damn good, with big improvements on the graphics with pristine controls the Nintendo 64 could only dream of. Two of the best handheld remakes I've ever played, but that's not the only amazing Zelda game we got on the system. A Link Between Worlds was a brand new 2D Zelda adventure that was essentially a sequel to A Link to the Past. A Link to the Past is in my opinion the best 2D Zelda game ever made, so getting a sequel was magical, especially one done as well as this. I'm not sure though if I would consider this a 2D game, as it's more like a 2.5D game. How do you get half a D? You don't want to know. This is one of the games that didn't need to take full advantage of the 3D capabilities of the system. So many games by the end of the system's life stopped including 3D into the games as they realized fewer and fewer people actually used it, as opposed to the beginning of the system where you couldn't find a game that didn't use 3D. Super Mario 3D Land, also known as the Mario game that no one remembers. One of the big titles Nintendo was marketing for the system that would take full advantage of 3D and implement it into the game, even though it still wasn't fully 3D and was mostly 2.5D. Not again! This was essentially a new Super Mario Bros. Game, but with depth added to make the levels more unique and not just moving left to right constantly. Which is good, since it's not like we have enough new Super Mario Bros. Games already. 3D Land is actually one of the best handheld Mario games out there. The 3D effects and gimmicks in the levels are all really well done and perfectly show off the system's unique capabilities. This is a phenomenal game to get the full experience of the 3DS, plus bringing back the Tanuki suit was a nice throwback as it hadn't been seen in a game in over 20 years. It's a shame the game isn't as well remembered as it should be, but there's a lot of reasons for that. For one, it's the most basic and overall least interesting of all the 3D Mario games. It doesn't have the same open world feel as the other games, and the only other 3D Mario game like it is just the same game, but better. 3D World is literally just the same game, but in HD with better level design and multiplayer, so who's gonna play 3D Land over it? Probably the 60 million people who bought a 3DS over a Wii U. It's way too generic and gets confused and mixed up with tons of different titles. You could say any of these games is called 3D Land and it would fit. Plus with 3D World having such a similar name and gameplay, I feel horrible for the grandma who had to buy this game for their kid for Christmas. Here Jimmy, here's your gift. But I was supposed to get 3D Land. I don't even own a Wii U. Well, would you rather get this or would you want to get coal? Coal, please. At least that has use for things that aren't dead. It wasn't just 3D Land that was getting lazy with its names. Oh no, it felt like every single game with Mario in the title was just basic as shit. New Super Mario Bros. 2. Yep, just another game to follow the New Super Mario Bros. Series on the DS. except this was the third game released. What happened to giving us creative titles? Okay, that makes sense since most Mario games have Super and it's on the Super Nintendo. Kinda boring, but most Nintendo 64 titles are boring, so I'll give it a pass. Now we're talking. This is what Mario Kart deserves. Perfection, just like the rest of this game. Okay, kinda getting a bit boring here, but I'm sure we'll get back to perfection. Well, it is for the Wii after all. I mean, at least we can't get any worse.
Mario Kart 7!
What the f is this? Why in the 7th game in the series do you decide to start numbering the games? I'd rather have you just name this Mario Kart 3DS instead of this. Take me back, take me back! Mario Kart and Smash Bros were two of the biggest and best games on the 3DS, even with their stupid fucking bullshit names, but that doesn't bother me, I swear. Mario Kart 7 added so much to the series with kart customization, gliders, and driving underwater. It was a great entry in the series even with its bad title. Smash Bros for 3DS was doomed from the start. This is a series that never should have left home consoles. The whole idea around Smash Bros is getting together with people and duking out in person on a TV. Not one of those words I just said mentioned anything about a handheld. With the digital age and online gaming upon us, it made sense in theory to make a Smash Bros game for 3DS and be able to play over Wi-Fi or local connectivity between consoles. But communism is also good in theory, and have you seen the Soviet Union? The game overall isn't bad by any means, but it's held back so much by the fact it's on the 3DS. The screen being so small means that not much of the battlefield can be displayed, which also takes away from the graphics too. I mean, they even showed in the trailers for this game how drastically different the graphics were between the Wii U and the 3DS versions. I don't think anyone saw these two graphic styles and said, I want that one. And then the controls aren't horrible either, but using the circle pad isn't as effective as using a real control stick. The Wii U version is just better in every way, except for Smash Run. Please bring that back, Nintendo. With every new handheld, there's one series that's bound to sell and convince millions of people to buy the console. Can you guess what it is? Pokemon X and Y were the first games to fully jump into 3D, except for all the other games that did it first. There would have been 3D Pokemon games prior on home consoles, but none were a main series game with a brand new generation. And it wasn't quite what we were expecting. They chose a chibi art style for the characters in the game, which when you think about it, makes sense. Literally every game before it had chibi style characters just in 2D, so switching to 3D isn't that surprising to keep it. I don't hate this art style. I just despise it. Maybe I'm being a bit too harsh, but I definitely prefer how the characters looked in Sun and Moon, where they actually look like people. X and Y used 3D many different ways throughout the game. Battles had more depth to them, certain areas in the game didn't feel so flat, and then the Holocaster display is 3D too. But to be honest, this really doesn't add a whole lot to the game. Sure, it's kind of a neat trick to see some 3D, but that's all it is. A neat trick. There's not a single thing in this game that actually needs 3D, but it was a nice way to show off the features of the system for the first time. Then Sun and Moon happened where they barely used 3D at all. They used it in the photo minigames as well as, that's it. The 3D effect in X and Y put such a strain on the console that the whole game would lag, which is why I think they took it out of Sun and Moon. Plus, there's not a single area in the game that would have benefited from 3D. Maybe the Ultra Warp Ride though, that would have been sick. The 3DS had loads of fantastic titles from franchises that hadn't had anything too spectacular in previous years. I already mentioned Kid Icarus Uprising, but saying its name doesn't do justice for how amazing of a game this is. For a franchise that hadn't had a game since before the end of the Cold War, it's amazing how much they packed in here. It didn't sell incredibly well compared to the big Nintendo franchises, but nobody expected it to. It was supposed to be a fun return to the series, which is exactly what we got. Kirby got some of the best games to date. We got a remake of Epic Yarn near the end of the system's life, which is one of my personal favorite Kirby games. Epic Yarn was such a unique take on the character whose games have been more or less the same for decades now. I loved the Wii version, and it wasn't too intensive to be put on a handheld, so it made perfect sense. And then we got the best Kirby game ever made at the time with Planet Robobot. I had never had this much fun with a Kirby game, which is saying a lot since every Kirby game is amazing. Even the quote-unquote bad ones like Star Allies are still good, but Planet Robobot knocked it out of the park. Kirby is one of the franchises that I feel like is made for handheld games. They started back on the Game Boy, and with their side-scrolling 2D adventures that aren't too story-intensive, they're perfect for short pick-up-and-play experiences. But what's not perfect for that? Why is this a thing? I love Xenoblade, and it's one of my favorite games of all time, so it's awesome for more people to be able to play the game. But they made no changes to this game from the original Wii version other than adding some cool 3D effects. The graphics look just as dog shit as they did before, maybe even worse. How could you be worse than this? And considering they made the definitive edition after this, there is no point to ever playing this version of the game. It's not a horrible port, but why on earth would you think releasing this for the 3DS in 2015 would be the series' saving grace? Is it because another Japanese franchise got a revival a few years earlier? That was an entirely new game though, and it didn't look like a hamster out the graphics. Fire Emblem Awakening was the rebirth of the Fire Emblem series after years of it getting stale and not getting any groundbreaking games. Sure as hell never stopped Sakurai from adding them in Smash Bros though. This helped bring more popularity to the franchise instead of many Westerners only knowing the series for having spiky-haired sword fighters in Smash Bros. When Cloud got thrown into the mix in Smash Bros, everyone got confused. Without this game, we never would have gotten 3 houses, which is more than enough reason for me to give this game its credit. I said I'd never talk crap about Fire Emblem again, and I'm sticking to it. Unless there's 3 new Fire Emblem characters in whatever Smash Bros game comes out after Ultimate. Then I'm gonna lose it! The 3DS overall has such a wide variety of games for the system that it's kinda hard to pinpoint exactly what their demographic was they were aiming for. It was a good system, even if it did have a game with the God of the Underworld in it. What, did you think I was talking about Kid Icarus? No, of course I'm talking about you! The 3DS wasn't a perfect console by any means, but it was an enormous success and a worthy successor of the DS line of systems. It really helped shape the idea that handheld games don't need to be basic. Sure, I will always prefer to play long games on a home console, and you may disagree with me, but that's just the opinion of someone who says Shadow the Hedgehog is the best Sonic game, so who's the real idiot here? With the mix of 3D remakes of old games like Majora's Mask, with returns to old franchises and even brand new series, the 3DS had something for everyone. 3D Effect may have not really changed the experience for most games, but for the ones that use it to the max, it was worth the price. It really could make you feel like you were inside the console, which is super cool for a system as small as this with no headset or goggles. There were some versions though, like the 2DS, that removed 3D entirely. These made much more sense as fewer games included 3D, and were pretty good affordable alternatives that helped you look like you were playing on a slice of bread. They also improved the console as a whole with the new Nintendo 3DS, and I thought the Wii U's name was bad. Despite the name sounding like a 4-year-old came up with it, it was actually a great upgrade and made every game run smoother. Plus it gave us a nipple to play with, so that's fun. The increase of big popular titles on the 3DS definitely helped shape Nintendo's next console to combine both the handheld and home console into one. The Switch is arguably the best Nintendo console to date, and we all have the 3DS to thank for that. I love the Switch, but I would have definitely loved to see what they could have done for the next fully handheld console. It's too bad we'll never know, but I'm sure someone out there knows. The fourth dimension sucks.